So I think in the past, we tended to neglect those complexities. And what I saw happen in the last few years is now we are engaging different elements of the West. Since independence, we really have a policy that connects to different corners of the West in a far more effective way than we had in the past.
So in this week's Rajamandala, you've looked at the developing rift between England and the US, Britain and the US on the one hand, and France on the other, vis-a-vis the submarine deal with Australia, which was scrapped somewhat unceremoniously, the French would argue, and not without merit, that it was all of a sudden with the deal with the UK-US for these nuclear submarines over traditionally fuel submarines. One of the big problems that you flag in your column, one of the dangers it appears is that, post-Brexit, anyway, there is a suspicion between Europe and Britain. It's not the EU of 5-10 years ago. Add to that the Indo-Pacific theater where some kind of unity vis-a-vis China, Russia, Pakistan is required. Do you see this rift going much deeper? And France, given its history, even despite being in NATO over sort of from de Gaulle's time, the sort of Gaullist independence, do you see that playing out in ways in which could actually benefit China and Russia and that sort of alliance, given their seeming unity at this point?
In fact, if the situation between France and the US and UK gets worse, they don't have to do too much with the Russians or the Chinese. I mean, that the weakening of the Western coalition itself will do enough damage. I mean, so they don't have to do especially positive. Just the very act of going at each other will undermine the West to some extent, especially since France has been such an active champion of Indo-Pacific. They've been doing things. So that is what it is. At this point, things seem to be escalating. My sense is one of the points we're making in the article is that, look, India should get the Quad and other friends on one side to find ways to mollify France, because it's not in India's interest to have this coalition weaken, and which makes our job of securing the Indo-Pacific that much harder. Because in the end, the objective of France, of India, of Britain, of US, of Australia is all the same. I mean, there must be an effective balance of power in the region. Akash, I want to move on to one important thing in the essay, that it has always been contradictions within the West. I mean, it's really partly India that saw the West as a single monolith, that it is a single monolith. There is something called the West, and that there were no independent interests and actions within the West. So this is one of the unfortunate legacies of the Cold War, that we saw two blocs. The simple Manichaean worldview, East versus the West, NATO versus Warsaw Pact, America versus Soviet Union. But within that, there was a lot of variation, there was a lot of problems, there was a lot of geopolitics within the region. So I think in the past, we tended to neglect those complexities. And what I saw happen in the last few years is now we are engaging different elements of the West. That is, we are not with the West or against the West. We engage the Americans, we do with the French, we want to do business with the Brits, we want to do, whether it is Sweden in the north, whether it is Denmark. We recently saw the Green Summit with Denmark, or our minister was recently in Slovenia attending a forum. So I think there is enough to be done in Europe alone. So the US and its allies, the allies matter as much because they're all rich, they're all developed. There's Canada, Australia, Europe, Japan. So they bring a lot to the table. And now I think for the first time, I would say, since independence, we really have a policy that connects to different corners of the West in a far more effective way than we had in the past.
So, taking off from what you just said, in the piece you point out how, at this point, just the kind of meetings Prime Minister Modi is going to be at New York in, and that Foreign Minister Jaishankar is going to have multiple meetings at the ministerial level as well. And that's going to be the sort of test. Everyone should read the piece where there is all of this in much more detail. It will be on the IndianExpress.com, of course, and probably where you're watching this video. So anyway, so in the piece, you talk about how this is going to be a bit of a test also, in a sense. You don't use that word, but for India's, how nimble-footed we are in our diplomacy, how much we can build on all these multiple relationships, what were not taken that seriously, say the various aspects of Europe in the West. What is, if anything, what are the signals we should expect, say, post the New York visit, post this UN visit, that say that, okay, there is some, India has had some effect and has been able to balance its interest with France, where we have, of course, trade, but also defense. France has been a major partner, which cannot be ignored, as well as a larger need for, these multiple partnerships. What is the 2 or 3 signals we should be looking for?
I would look for the meeting between Minister Jaishankar and the French Foreign Minister Le Drian. That India has a stake in keeping France in the Indian Ocean and the Indo-Pacific. So if there's some sense of, look, we need to intensify the strategic cooperation between the two of us. I mean, it can't be done overnight, but a political signal in the meeting that, look, for France to reassure France, just because they've had a problem with Australia and UK and US does not mean we have a problem with them, and that we want to keep them in the region because we value their presence. Second is at the Quad summit in Washington. Now, if collectively we have the Quad saying that, look, what's happened with the France, is unfortunate. We want to draw France into the engagement, because the issues is not just about submarine. There are a whole range of new technologies that the Australia, UK, US partnership is talking about. So some way of, right now, French are so angry, they might not be ready to be mollified at this stage. But I think from the Quad side, there must be a genuine effort to reach out to France. The other important thing is that India's bilateral meetings with Australia and with Japan, because while there will be the Quad, there's also the bilaterals with these two countries. It was really Japan's idea to bring France and UK more actively into the Indo-Pacific. Because Japan was, in fact, Indo-Pacific itself was their idea. So they were looking ahead and say, look, we need to get the Europeans into this. So I think Japan can play an important role as well in working with us, we can working with them to make sure that there is a widest possible participation in the Indo-Pacific coalition. And then with Australia, of course, itself, whether we can do something with them in terms of expanding our own engagement. Finally, I would say the summit between Biden and Modi, that's really the first substantive physical meeting. And we're already into the 9th month of the Biden administration. There's so much happening in Washington. So this is the moment, I think, to really to look ahead and see what all we can do with the US. Because if you know, there was a story in Nikkei Asia which said the Quad is going to look at semiconductor supply chains. Yeah. See, right now the world is totally dependent on Taiwan for the production of chips. And if you're trying to buy a car in India, you're not able to get cars because there are no chips that go into it. And then chips are everywhere, in telephones to computers to more sophisticated applications. So I think if India can join the US and then the Quad to begin to construct advance India's technological base, that will be a huge leap in terms of India's national capabilities. So I would say this is going to be an exciting week in the US, and I think a lot of things could clarify in terms of where India's relationships with the key elements of the West are headed.
The final question is, but you talk about how there's a sort of, and you mentioned it in answer to an earlier question as well, this sort of non-alignment hangover, Cold War hangover, where we seem to look at the world, and that gave into a certain kind of this idea of multipolarity, which BRICS was a big part of. SARC had some kind of, was part of that imagination. And that is sort of waning now. There's a new kind of multipolarity now that we have to look at with China. This episode with France and the way we're considering Europe now, you've hinted at what kind of forums, like at this point, say, for example, you say that India should be playing a greater role given how many friends it has in the region. Its own importance as both a strategic player and as a market. Going forward, is there a multiple alignment strategy? Is that the kind of thing India should be looking at? Or not alignment at all, but sectional interests, specific interests with specific countries, and do its best to manage these contradictions where it can?
I think there was a double tragedy at the end of the Second World War. I mean, I think one was created by the Russian leader Stalin, Stalin said, look, after the Second World War, actually, if you remember, Russia, Soviet Union, and America were allies in defeating fascist Germany. And of course, there were problems at the end of the war. And within 2 years, Stalin declared that, look, the world is divided into two camps. There is the East and there is the West. And that there's nothing in between. So it really codified what was a complex world into a neat division. And I think that has had a very negative effect on how progressives in India thought about the world. Because within Indian progressive movement itself, I mean, if you go back to the communists, there was a sense that, look, it's not just India versus East versus the West. There are progressive movements. There are different, there were communist movements strong everywhere, and you can't simply make the world into two boxes. And then Nehru's own policy, saying that, look, we're not going to accept this neat division, and for which he was denounced both by the left and the right. And that he said, look, we must carve out an independent path in a world where others say there are only two options. But I think what happened was this, what began as a sophisticated policy, ended up in simply non-alignment meant keeping away from the US. It became anti-Western, from saying we will choose a path in between to one of becoming just anti-US and anti-Western. And I think that cut out a lot of flexibility for us. And otherwise, look, we had inherited a lot of connections with the Europeans, because some of the oldest investments in India were all European companies. The Brits, of course, as colonial rulers, they had deep connections. So we kind of squandered a lot of that. And you saw how China from nowhere came in the 70s and used the West, its education institutions, its technology institutions, its business collaboration to dramatically transform itself. While we were into this anti-Western mode for a long, long time, and it's been very difficult to shed it even now. So I think what we say, look, I'm going to go by my interests. So I don't start with whether it is non-alignment, multi-alignment, no alignment, which is the kind of a red herring that has really troubled Indian thinking. You say, look, these are my interests today. I want to modernize my economy. Who can do it best for me? Who can give me the best terms? I want to be more secure. I want to produce more weapons in India. Who can give me the best different terms for defense production in India? And if I say, look, I need to build reactors, who gives me a best deal? So instead of that, we went into this, look, this morning, am I equidistant from the East and the West? Am I becoming too close to the Americans? I think we are big enough now. I didn't mention this in the piece. Today, India, France, and Britain are all tied around $3 trillion economies. So the fourth, fifth, sixth positions in the world are, depending on the exchange rates, today it is Britain, India, and France, all around $3 trillion. So we are in a different place. And I think we should be confident and we say, look, we can think for ourselves. We know what our interests are and how to secure them. And that is in the major power, great power domain. But when it comes to neighborhood, I think we need to, for example, drawing Bangladesh into a greater regional integration. So if India does things with its neighbors, which is open to doing, like Pakistan is not, but Bangladesh is, can we do more things to integrate Bangladesh with us? Can we open up trade with Nepal? And other aspect is beyond our immediate neighbors. Indonesia, for example, today is going to be very concerned about all the nuclear submarines and all this stuff. So we need to reach out to our other maritime neighbors and tell them, look, this is what we're doing. This is not what is happening. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in Southeast Asia, in Central Asia, in Africa, in the Gulf, who are all frightened by a potential Cold War that is beginning to reemerge. So I think we have a lot of work. Hopefully in New York, we will be reaching out to non-Western, non-developed, the North to global South and see how we can work together in the days ahead, which is going to be a very challenging period for the world as a whole.
Okay, so we will keep an eye on New York. I'm sure you can see that in multiple places, including the Indian Express. Thank you so much. See you next week.
Thank you.